Hello. I'd like to talk to you today about the structure of the relative clause. Because it's a clause, it naturally has a subject and a verb. However, because it's also a relative clause, it differs from other clauses in some interesting ways. Let's take a closer look. To begin, the subject of a relative clause is usually a kind of word called a relative pronoun. Because it's a pronoun, it stands in for a noun, and that it's relative means that it shows relation. In other words, it points back to the noun it's standing in for. The good news about relative pronouns is that you only have to memorize 3. That, which, and who or whom. When you see one of these words, you can usually be sure that you're about to see a relative clause. Now, as you may remember, the job of a relative clause is to give more information about a noun. Consider this example. I like the people who like me. Notice that this sentence has a main clause with a subject and a verb, and it also has a direct object, which is people. But which people am I talking about? Which people do I like? The relative clause works as an adjective to describe these people. The subject of the clause points back to the noun the clause wants to describe, and the verb tells my reader what the noun does that makes it different from other nouns. Who are these people and what do they do that makes them different from other people? Thus, the relative clause gives my reader more information about my idea. The readers, therefore, can understand me more accurately. However, because English is complicated, sometimes the relative pronoun in a relative clause acts as a direct object. Consider this example. People whom I like make me smile. In this case, the relative clause has a subject that is not the relative pronoun. Indeed, the action of the verb goes to the relative pronoun, even though the pronoun still points back to the main noun. What makes this tricky is that when the pronoun works as a direct object like this, we sometimes just leave it out. We can just as naturally say, people I like make me smile. The relative clause is harder to spot in this case, but we can see its effect in the extra subject and the extra verb. I hope this video has made the relative clause easier for you to understand and use. It is a good way to give your sentences more variety by adding more information. It's a good way to include information in a sentence without necessarily having to write an entire new sentence. It can help your reader have a better time reading your work. Thank you for your time and attention.